Vietnam War in April 1954 had reached a critical point. The French government was desperately requesting immediate American military intervention. Their entire garrison at Dien Bien Phu, 15,000 soldiers, was on the verge of total destruction. Communist forces had encircled them. The French needed American aircraft carriers. They needed bombers. They demanded action within days, or 15,000 French soldiers would be captured or killed. President Dwight Eisenhower put the cable down and looked at the men gathered in his office. Vice President Richard Nixon insisted on helping the French. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles agreed. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Admiral Arthur Radford already had a strike plan ready. Every advisor in the room was certain. The United States had to intervene. The question wasn't whether to act, but how quickly American forces could reach Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was a valley in northern Vietnam, near the Laotian border. The French had flown 15,000 troops there in late 1953. General Henri Navarre believed the fortress would draw Viet Minh forces into open battle. The French had superior artillery and air power. They could destroy the Communist army in a decisive engagement. It looked like a textbook application of conventional military doctrine. The problem was obvious to anyone who understood the terrain. The valley was surrounded by hills. Viet Minh commander General Vo Nguyen Giap understood the French strategy. They had built a trap for themselves. Giap spent months moving heavy artillery through jungle terrain the French considered impassable. Over 200 artillery pieces were positioned on the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu. Among them were Soviet-built Katyusha rocket launchers. The French called them Stalin's organs. By March 1954, the garrison was surrounded. Viet Minh artillery could hit any position in the valley. French aircraft trying to resupply the fortress were being shot down. The garrison was slowly starved and shelled into submission. Soldiers were eating rats to survive. The wounded could not be evacuated. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. 2 months earlier, John Foster Dulles had delivered the most important foreign policy speech of Eisenhower's presidency, unveiling the doctrine of massive retaliation. The United States would not match communist forces, gun for gun or soldier for soldier. Any aggression would be met instantly with force, anywhere America chose, implicitly signaling nuclear weapons. The speech was designed to terrify the Soviets, but it also boxed in Eisenhower's administration. Now the French were calling America's bluff. If Dulles meant what he said, this was the moment to prove it. Communist forces were overrunning a key Western ally. The Domino theory suggested that losing Vietnam would lead to the fall of all Southeast Asia. Dulles had promised immediate retaliation. The French fortress was about to fall. The world was watching. Were America's threats real or empty? Vice President Nixon insisted intervention was essential. He warned Eisenhower, losing Vietnam would mean losing the entire region to communism. Admiral Radford had the plan ready. The aircraft carriers Essex and Boxer were already in the region. Strikes could launch within 48 hours. Radford believed American air power could break the siege and save the French garrison. The National Security Council and most of the Joint Chiefs supported intervention. Congressional leaders promised support if America's allies joined the effort. Dulles reached out to Britain. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 79 years old and serving his second term, refused. "Better jaw than war," he said. No amount of air power would change the fundamental reality. The Vietnamese were fighting for independence, not for France. Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway requested a private meeting with Eisenhower. He warned, airstrikes alone would accomplish nothing. Viet Minh would retreat into the jungle and wait for the planes to leave. Saving the French position would require ground troops. At least 7 American divisions, 12 if China entered the war. Supply lines would be impossible. France was losing control. How many Americans would die trying to hold what the French could not defend? On April 3, 1954, a full cabinet meeting convened. Dulles, Nixon, and Radford demanded action. Eisenhower listened carefully. He understood something the civilian advisers did not. Wars do not end the way politicians plan. If you think the United States should have intervened in 1954, hit like, subscribe, and leave one short comment. What would you have done in Eisenhower's place? Let us know if you would risk American troops for France. Dien Bien Phu was collapsing. On May 7, 1954, after 56 days of relentless siege, the French garrison finally surrendered. Over 2,000 soldiers were dead. Another 11,000 became prisoners of the Viet Minh. The valley, once considered impregnable, was a tomb. American eyes were fixed on Vietnam, but Eisenhower had made his choice. No U.S. military intervention, no carriers, no bombers. He understood what his military advisers did not. Air power alone could not win wars rooted in politics. The fall of Dien Bien Phu sent shockwaves through Paris. The French government was stunned. Their empire in Indochina had crumbled. Colonial pride and decades of investment vanished in a single moment. Back in Washington, Dulles, Nixon, and Radford were outraged. They believed America could have saved the French. They imagined aircraft carriers launching strikes within 48 hours, the siege broken, the French garrison relieved. But Eisenhower had known the terrain, the people, and the politics. The Vietnamese did not fight for communism alone. They fought to end colonial domination. Air raids could destroy supplies and fortifications, but they could not change hearts and minds. Eisenhower's decision to remain still reflected decades of experience. He had commanded forces in Europe, seen millions of soldiers thrown into battle, witnessed the limits of firepower. He understood that inserting U.S. troops into Indochina would require divisions, 7 at minimum, perhaps 12 if China intervened, and supply lines, stretching through jungles, rivers, and mountains. The French had struggled with 200,000 troops, yet they were losing. Eisenhower calculated the human cost. Thousands of American lives would be spent defending a colonial enterprise destined to fail. By mid-May, the world knew the outcome. The French at Dien Bien Phu marched into captivity. The Viet Minh celebrated a historic victory. Ho Chi Minh's forces had demonstrated that determination, terrain, and tactical ingenuity could defeat superior firepower. For America, this was both a warning and a lesson. Massive retaliation did not apply to every battlefield. Nukes were irrelevant in the valleys of Southeast Asia. Conventional intervention could not resolve political conflicts where local populations demanded independence. Immediately after the fall, diplomatic efforts intensified. Representatives from France, Vietnam, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union gathered in Geneva in mid-1954. The objective was clear: establish a ceasefire and negotiate the future of Indochina. The talks were tense. Ho Chi Minh's government pressed for full independence. France sought to preserve some influence, yet its military and political position was shattered. On the 17th parallel, a compromise was reached. Vietnam would be temporarily divided. The North fell under Ho Chi Minh's communist government. The South would be led by a pro-Western administration, supported indirectly by the United States. Elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country, though everyone understood those elections would never occur. The Geneva Accords were signed, but John Foster Dulles refused to participate formally. The United States would not accept responsibility for the partition. Eisenhower, while silently approving the agreement, knew intervention would only create further complications. In Paris, the consequences were immediate. France's colonial empire in Southeast Asia was finished. Politicians and generals alike reeled from the realization that their military and economic might could not impose order or maintain control. In Washington, the advisers who had lobbied for intervention were demoralized. Dulles publicly claimed that America would have acted if Britain had joined, but Britain had refused. Churchill's decision was decisive. Jaw, not war, he insisted. The British Prime Minister understood that colonial wars could not be solved by foreign air power alone. Meanwhile, Eisenhower set in motion an alternative strategy. In January 1955, he authorized the first shipments of military aid to the newly established South Vietnamese government. Advisors were sent to train the army, initially temporary, not combatants. The goal was to create a stable pro-Western state in Saigon without deploying American troops. Ngo Dinh Diem was installed as president. He was autocratic, unpopular, but anti-communist and pro-American. Eisenhower had drawn a line. No combat forces, only advisors, training, strategy, and indirect support. This approach reflected a larger principle. Military force could not impose political solutions. Dien Bien Phu had proven that airstrikes, artillery, or elite troops could not change the fundamental will of a people. Yet Washington watched closely. Kennedy, inheriting this framework in 1961, would escalate. Advisors grew in number, slowly converting from trainers to combat participants. The distinction blurred, yet Eisenhower's restraint had saved thousands of American lives. The fall of Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva negotiations, and the creation of South Vietnam established a precedent. American intervention would be measured, indirect, and restrained, at least for the moment. Eisenhower had chosen caution over the immediate clamor for action. History would soon test the wisdom of that restraint. By the early 1960s, the seeds planted by Dien Bien Phu had grown into a looming storm. When John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in January 1961, he inherited Eisenhower's Vietnam policy. No combat troops, only advisors. Initially, the plan was limited: training, strategic guidance, support for South Vietnam's pro-Western government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. But the pressure was relentless. Advisors in Washington, many of whom had argued for intervention in 1954, warned Kennedy that inaction would mean the fall of South Vietnam. Kennedy increased the number of American advisors to 16,000 by 1963. Pilots began flying combat missions, marking the first time U.S. forces directly engaged the Viet Cong in hostilities. The line between advising and fighting dissolved in the jungles. Every day, American blood was spilled, though the mission was framed as defensive. Kennedy justified the escalation by claiming the troops were not combatants. They were assisting the South Vietnamese army. Reality, however, painted a different picture. November 1963 brought Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon Baines Johnson assumed the presidency. By this time, the Viet Cong insurgency had intensified. Johnson's advisors pressed for further escalation. They promised that limited force, carefully applied, could stabilize South Vietnam. But the lessons from Dien Bien Phu had been ignored. Matthew Ridgway's warning from 1954 that intervention without adequate political strategy would require multiple divisions remained unheeded. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. That number equated to 27 divisions. Chinese forces had entered, supporting North Vietnam indirectly. The war had grown beyond any plan or expectation. It was no longer a limited engagement. It was a quagmire consuming men, money, and political capital. President Johnson watched the conflict spiral, unable to reverse momentum. Ridgway's predictions had been accurate. Limited military action could not succeed where political realities were ignored. The human cost was staggering. By 1975, 58,000 American soldiers were dead. Over 100,000 were wounded. The financial cost exceeded $140 billion in U.S. currency. The war fractured American society more deeply than any event since the Civil War. Protests, riots, and political upheaval became the norm. The dream of a stable, pro-Western Vietnam was lost. The North Vietnamese Communists achieved victory, just as Ridgway had predicted 2 decades earlier. All the air power, all the ground troops, all the money could not create a government the Vietnamese would support. The same political reality that doomed the French in 1954 doomed the Americans in 1975. Nationalism and the desire for self-determination outweighed foreign military assistance. Eisenhower had understood this in 1954. Kennedy and Johnson did not. Their successors paid the ultimate price: American lives, credibility, and political stability. Eisenhower watched the escalation from afar, rarely commenting publicly. Privately, he expressed frustration. He had shown his successors how to avoid the trap, but they had chosen differently. Carrier strikes might have saved Dien Bien Phu temporarily, but what then? Occupation, counterinsurgency, endless supply lines, decades of fighting in unfamiliar terrain. The questions he had asked in 1954 remained unanswered. His restraint had saved thousands of lives. Their action cost 58,000. This was the ultimate lesson in leadership. Sometimes saying no requires more courage than saying yes. Immediate political pressure, popular opinion, and advisory consensus might push a leader to act, but long-term consequences define history. Eisenhower had chosen prudence. His successors had chosen motion, and history had vindicated his caution. The Vietnam War's escalation revealed a simple, tragic truth. Military power alone cannot solve political problems. A nation can drop bombs, send divisions, and spend billions. Yet if the local population rejects foreign control, the outcome is inevitable. The Americans learned this lesson the hard way. The French had learned it first. Dien Bien Phu had been the warning. Washington ignored it. In the end, the cost of ignoring history was staggering. 58,000 American lives lost, hundreds of thousands wounded, over $140 billion spent. A society divided, a presidency destroyed, credibility questioned. And all because political realities had been overlooked in favor of immediate military action.